Greetings to the chosen ones. Their aim was never to completely eliminate you. Their mission was to erode your dignity gradually, publicly, and permanently. However, they made one fatal miscalculation. An awakened soul, armed with keen perception, moves through the world as a mobile deception detector, cloaked in calm resolve. Draw yourself nearer now. What unfolds next may resonate in ways that feel almost too close. Strip away the pretense for a moment. What you experienced wasn't some chance conflict, a difficult chapter, or merely troubled individuals acting out. Not even close. What you survived was a calculated ceremony, an orchestrated effort to demean, alienate, and mentally obliterate you under everyone's gaze. And this is the reality most refuse to swallow. Inside cults, covert brotherhoods, and circles of spiritual exploitation, public degradation ranks among the oldest ceremonies deployed to fracture someone's identity without ever touching them. And here's the kicker. You weren't a participant in that ceremony. You were the sacrifice. They wrapped it in language of care, correction, or simple confusion. Yet underneath, it was a soul-level execution masked by warm expressions. They craved your silence. They wanted you doubting your own perception. They wanted you begging forgiveness for bleeding out from their blade. Yet consider the twist. You didn't shatter. You didn't unravel. You didn't even unmask them. You perceived. You studied the game while they assumed you were paralyzed. You memorized their lines before they could deliver them, and while they plotted to shame you, you became painfully conscious of who they truly were. Honestly, if your existence were a streaming series, that degradation ceremony would have functioned as the season finale. Unexpected turn, you greenlit another season minus the vipers in the cast. And today, we're moving past simply revisiting what you endured. We're exposing the hidden machinery behind it, why your destruction was essential to them, why your spiritual sharpness transformed you into a threat, and why your quietness was never surrender. It was calculated strategy. So prepare yourself, because once this video wraps, they will find it impossible to gaslight you back into spiritual bondage. Number one, they needed to shatter your image because your essence was far too pure for their corrupt schemes. They didn't shame you due to weakness on your part. They did it because your spirit stood too untainted for the filth they were engaged in. You occupied spaces where manipulation served as the common currency, and commitment was merely terminology used to ensnare others. You arrived carrying innocence, sincerity, and an unclouded heart. And they interpreted that as danger, not because you broadcast it, but because it illuminated how far removed they had become from anything resembling authenticity. Your mere presence stirred their conscience. That's precisely why they had to twist the storyline and rewrite the facts. Their only path to justifying their unease around you was casting you as the issue. They had no desire to battle you. They aimed to taint you. If they could plant sideways glances in others' eyes, then your character would lose its force. Their objective was never to out-argue you with evidence. It was to make you doubt your own memory, your instincts, and your grasp on what was real. They desired to fracture your self-perception. They wanted to corrupt how you viewed yourself. And the painful reality is it nearly succeeded. You began questioning whether perhaps you were the source of trouble. Perhaps you were being overly dramatic. That represents spiritual conflict in tangible form. It doesn't always arrive bearing hexes or sorcery. Occasionally it arrives cloaked in worry, in quietness, in disloyalty, accompanied by a smile and a handshake. Yet what they failed to grasp was that your perceptiveness was far more than mere instinct. It functioned as a survival tool. Something within you began registering the patterns, the timing, the transformation of smiles into stabs. While they performed for spectators, you observed in stillness, deciphering every maneuver. And that became their undoing. They assumed you were absorbed by the hurt, yet you were fully conscious. You witnessed individuals who professed devotion to you step forward for your dismantling, and you never lost track of who actually appeared. That's precisely why your essence has become threatening now. Because you didn't simply endure, you awakened. And once an individual like you awakens, they become ungovernable. They cannot be degraded in the same manner again, because they identify the design before it launches. They recognize authenticity, and they no longer hesitate to depart, even if that means walking solo. Number two, you weren't facing rejection. You were being examined by the cosmos itself. What you lived through wasn't dismissal. It represented a spiritual examination. Existence wasn't excluding you. It was scrutinizing you, investigating every tie, every conviction, every concealed wound. The disgrace you encountered wasn't merely an assault. It functioned as a sacred arrangement, designed to reveal what could not advance alongside you into your next phase. Each instance of being overlooked, ridiculed, separated, or abandoned carried pain, certainly, yet it was also precise. It represented the divine drawing back the veil on realities invisible to ordinary sight. You believed people were transforming, behaving differently, growing distant, yet the truth revealed they were finally displaying what had been present from the start. That compelled distance, that silent treatment, that unexpected assault on your character, those represented no accidents. That was spiritual awareness at work. And you maintained your rhythm because your perception began cutting sharper amid the disorder. While everything surrounding you appeared to be collapsing, something inside you was crystallizing painfully. The commitment you invested was never being reciprocated, and the devotion you extended was never genuinely received. You weren't being penalized, you were being refined. This remains what nobody discloses. Elevation demands revelation, and revelation doesn't always manifest as people being exposed. It manifests as you finally perceiving. The ceremony of degradation had to unfold publicly so that you would cease making justifications for people privately. That's precisely why it required volume. That's precisely why it required chaos. That's precisely why gentleness was never part of it. Because the truth about your surroundings carried too much weight for gentle delivery. You didn't forfeit connections. You surrendered illusions. You didn't miss chances. You released diversions. What you acquired was lucidity. You developed the capacity to identify a manufactured grin. You developed the boldness to follow your intuition immediately. You developed self-regard at a price most individuals refuse to shoulder. So no, you weren't facing rejection. You were being revealed unto yourself. And the rejection that registered as punishment was genuinely liberation. You weren't expelled. You were emancipated. Because where you stand now, only the genuine can accompany you, and everything artificial had to be expelled harshly, publicly, and permanently. Number 3, they craved not your demise. They craved your existence in spiritual stagnation. They never desired to end you physically. That would have proven too transparent. What they genuinely desired was for you to remain breathing, yet depleted, uncertain, second-guessing every conviction you possessed. They desired you spiritually immobilized. They wanted to sever you from your internal guidance system, because as long as you doubted yourself, they could maintain dominance. Their aim wasn't your destruction. It was your muteness, your bewilderment, your spiritual severance. Through that mechanism, they could persist in drawing from your vitality while you diminished silently in the periphery. You must grasp the distinction. Certain adversaries seek to annihilate you, certainly, yet others seek to confine you, and those prove the most perilous. They arrive with warm expressions, they feign helpfulness, they extend assistance while implanting seeds of uncertainty into your essence. Every flattery conceals a barb, every jest carries a wound. They observe you thoroughly enough to determine what grants you strength. Then they gradually begin persuading you that such strength constitutes a problem. You commence reducing your voice, contracting your existence, dimming your radiance, and you interpret it as modesty, though in reality it amounts to programming. They weren't attempting to trigger your eruption. They were attempting to make you vanish quietly without resistance. That represents how degradation functions. It advances gradually, operates beneath awareness, and aims to exhaust you from within. It wasn't focused on humiliating you once and advancing. It focused on compelling you to internalize shame so thoroughly that you exclude yourself from the existence you were destined to inhabit. Yet consider what failed to enter their calculations. Your perception activated at the critical moment. That instinctive knowing, that unsettling tension, that voice murmuring, something feels wrong. Even when you couldn't articulate it, that represented your salvation. Not fury, not vengeance, perception. You commenced detecting the patterns, the energy fluctuations, the artificial laughter, the veiled insults, and rather than erupting, you watched, you withdrew, you shielded your essence. And while they remained occupied attempting to shape your self-perception, you were silently recalling your identity. And presently they're experiencing alarm because the single outcome they dreaded most has materialized. You continue breathing, and now you perceive everything. Number 4, your degradation functioned as a triggered siren that unveiled their concealed syndicate of domination. The instant they attempted to shame you publicly, they accomplished more than merely displaying their animosity. They inadvertently triggered the alarm across an entire concealed apparatus. Individuals you had never addressed suddenly formed judgments. Strangers commenced treating you as a source of difficulty. Without warning, whispers materialized, smirks surfaced, and silent gazes followed. And it registered as nonsensical until the pattern became clear. What you underwent wasn't merely private betrayal. It represented the exposure of a concealed network that had been functioning covertly throughout. A spiritual syndicate of manipulation, gossip, and unspoken allegiance to dysfunction, and your awakening set it ablaze. You transformed into the threat the moment you ceased operating in diminished capacity. When you commenced questioning matters, moving differently, protecting your tranquility. That's when they transitioned from passive to aggressive. Not because you caused them harm, but because you ceased permitting yourself to be directed. And that destabilized their foundation, because beneath the superficial drama existed a collective united in unspoken agreement to resist transformation, to resist development, to preserve conditions artificial, surface level, and controlled. And you fractured that agreement simply through honesty. The public degradation was designed to isolate you, yet it achieved the opposite. It unveiled them. It demonstrated who had been observing silently, who had been communicating secretly, who had been feigning neutrality while stoking the flames. The identical individuals who declared their non-involvement suddenly displayed intense investment in your dismantling. That carries no element of coincidence. That represents coordination, and they didn't coordinate from a position of strength. They coordinated from fear. Fear that you might voice something irretrievable. Fear that you would expose something they had preserved in burial. You transformed into a mirror, and none among them wished to gaze into it. So they selected the ancient ceremony of degradation to redirect attention from themselves. Yet, through that act, they displayed their strategy. You didn't merely survive the ceremony, you decoded it. And presently you recognize they never functioned as individuals. They functioned as a system, and you fractured it without deliberate effort. Number 5, perception transcends being a characteristic. It operates as a survival instrument for the chosen. Perception extends far beyond a casual spiritual endowment you carry lightly. It constitutes your inherent survival framework. For a chosen individual, it represents the dividing line between entering a trap or departing with your spirit preserved. Most individuals encounter intuition resembling a passing breeze, something they either register or dismiss. Yet for you, it registers differently. Your perception carries no gentleness. It doesn't murmur. It strikes like an internal alert, like spiritual sonar registering elements people haven't yet vocalized. And you have developed trust in it, not because you carry paranoia, but because it has never faltered. People fail to comprehend how you recognize things before they unfold. They attribute it to chance or label you excessively reactive, excessively wary, or condemning. Yet that stems from their inexperience with surviving betrayal, wearing a friendly expression. They have never occupied spaces where they functioned as the unaware target of silent sabotage. You have consequently your perception intensified from necessity, not preference. You didn't merely detect harmful energy. You pursued it. You sensed shifts in tone, hesitation in speech, tension within the quiet. You perceived the vibrational shift when falsehoods entered the space. Your escape from their snares carried no element of fortune, and it certainly carried no element of excessive analysis. It represented real-time sacred intelligence being transmitted into your spirit before your conscious mind could rationalize it. And rather than awaiting verification, you moved when your spirit commanded departure. That explains why you survived circumstances designed to annihilate you. Perception preserved you from connections that appeared flawless superficially, yet carried poison beneath. It preserved you from arrangements, friendships, even surroundings that masqueraded as openings yet genuinely functioned as enclosures. It excluded you from circumstances where your name had already been designated before your arrival. That explains why the degradation failed to shatter you. It revealed how precise your perception had remained throughout as you perceived through the disguises. And when you lacked tangible evidence, your spirit possessed the blueprint. That explains how you navigate differently, and it explains why you remain standing. Because chosen individuals don't speculate, they recognize, and when you recognize, you require no demonstration. You simply withdraw quietly, strategically, and breathing. Number 6, they examined you as though you constituted the adversary because they recognized you as the evidence. They didn't examine you from curiosity. They examined you because they experienced terror. Terror regarding what you carried. Terror regarding what your presence exposed without deliberate effort. You didn't enter their domain brandishing a banner or seeking to establish anything. You simply existed, carrying a pure heart, transparent intentions, and no concealed agenda. And that alone proved sufficient to disturb every artificial structure they had constructed around themselves. You functioned as evidence that recovery remains achievable, that forgiveness without requiring retaliation remains real, that someone can navigate through hell and emerge with gentle spirit intact, not embittered. You didn't merely articulate truth, you embodied it. And for individuals who had constructed their existence on manipulation, fear, presentation, and authority, your presence registered not as comfort, it registered as confrontation. You didn't arrive to expose them. Yet your existence, your journey, your energy exposed everything they were striving to conceal. You functioned as a mirror they never requested, and you reflected backward everything they preferred not to perceive. So, they needed to examine you, not to comprehend you, but to invalidate you. They required determining whether your illumination carried authenticity or merely represented another illusion resembling their own. And when you refused to fracture under duress, when you declined retaliation as they anticipated, when you preserved your dignity even after they stripped you of everything, that's when they recognized you didn't belong among them. You couldn't be converted, governed, or corrupted. That explains why you received labels of excessiveness, excessive sensitivity, excessive depth. It stemmed not from your actual nature. It stemmed from your excessive authenticity for their game, excessive wholeness for their storyline. You failed to conform to their pattern, so they attempted to fracture you. Yet your spirit remained intact, and they harbored resentment because you didn't merely carry truth. You validated it through quiet, consistent living, devoid of performance requirements. Within a world that compensates artificiality, someone who resists purchase, influence, or manipulation constitutes danger. That explains why they treated you as the adversary, because to them you represented not evil, but incorruptibility, and nothing intimidates deception like a soul immune to distortion. Number 7, they orchestrated a public spectacle because concealed sabotage achieved nothing. They initiated with subtlety behind secured doors, in whispered dialogues, with calculated arrangements designed to generate self-doubt. They attempted concealed sabotage initially because it carried greater safety. It permitted them to maintain their reputation while permitting you to hemorrhage in silence. They believed that through sufficient narrative manipulation, you would self-destruct without their direct involvement. Yet you didn't fracture. You perceived. You recalibrated. You maintained your presence, and that troubled them beyond their projections. You didn't collapse into their snares. You didn't accept their bait. The indirect insults achieved nothing. The deliberate forgetfulness failed to destabilize you. You commenced navigating differently, and that's when they experienced panic, because concealed sabotage depends on one element, your unawareness. Yet once you commenced paying attention and labeling it accurately, even within your spirit alone, they forfeited their control. So they needed to alter their approach. If concealed damage couldn't eliminate you, they calculated public degradation might succeed. If they couldn't isolate you through lies, they attempted to flatten you through spectacle. They constructed a performance surrounding your identity, amplified your imperfections, dragged your history into discussions unrelated to current circumstances, and it carried no connection to truth. It connected to volume. Sufficient volume to overwhelm your account. Sufficient boldness to destabilize anyone remaining in your support. Their aspiration extended beyond mere embarrassment. It aimed to shame you into muteness, to render you too frightened to stand upright again. Yet rather than fracturing, you persevered. Rather than concealing, you intensified. Rather than defending yourself through volume, you permitted their exhibition to condemn itself. And it did. What they failed to anticipate was how many individuals would commence detecting the pattern, the fixation, the extremes they pursued, because when someone invests that effort into destroying someone who refuses retaliation, people commence posing questions. The identical platform they erected to shame you concluded by illuminating their fixation. And you preserved your spirit undamaged. You didn't merely survive their exhibition, you outlasted it, which ultimately validated what they had dreaded throughout. You never constituted the problem. You constituted the evidence that they had forfeited authority. Number 8, you were designated to drown in shame, yet you acquired breathing beneath psychological waters. They desired more than your embarrassment. They desired your emotional obliteration. Their objective extended beyond simply damaging your reputation before others. It aimed to turn you against yourself. They desired burying you beneath shame so profoundly that even within a silent chamber, your thoughts would replay their assaults like a damaged recording. They desired their voices to inhabit your cognition long after they concluded speaking. That represented the genuine ceremony, psychological suffocation disguised as conflict. Yet you didn't drown as they anticipated. You recalibrated gradually, painfully, yet powerfully, while they cast you into emotional depths you had never navigated. You weren't merely descending, you were adapting. You commenced breathing where respiration seemed impossible. You commenced identifying the manipulation, the guilt induction, the distorted versions of events. You ceased attempting to argue, ceased attempting to justify yourself to individuals who had predetermined that you required the role of villain. And within that quietness, something extraordinary materialized. You developed resilience. You commenced surviving within toxic surroundings without becoming toxic yourself. You acquired the capacity to reason clearly even while your identity faced assault. You discovered peace amid psychological chaos. While they anticipated shame would annihilate you, it actually conditioned you. Your cognition sharpened. Your emotional sophistication advanced. You commenced recognizing patterns, strategies, and power maneuvers before they achieved completion. The identical circumstances that previously destabilized you transformed into information. The identical spaces that previously triggered anxiety transformed into training grounds where you practiced maintaining stability. That represents what they never anticipated. They believed shame would sink you, yet it transformed you into an accomplished deep diver. You didn't merely survive the manipulation, you decoded it. You constructed resilience within silence. And presently, you register no panic when waters ascend. You don't battle the current. You interpret it because you received training where most individuals would have drowned. And presently, when someone attempts manipulation or initiates conflict, they fail to recognize you have already mastered breathing in those depths. You no longer fear the depths. You embody the depths. Number 9, they labeled it devotion, allegiance, and kinship. Yet your perception revealed it as a ceremony of sacrifice. They disguised it as devotion, allegiance, and kinship. The variety of terminology that softens hearts and lowers defenses. You accepted it because you desired acceptance. Who would refuse embrace from those they trusted? Yet beneath the exterior, it carried darker substance. What they designated as devotion functioned as ceremony, a calculated performance structured to maintain your confinement and diminished state. You were never intended to expand beyond the boundaries they established. Instead, you were being prepared for sacrifice gradually and systematically, while they smiled and claimed it served your highest good. You failed to recognize it initially. The murmurings of, "We act thus because we care," or "This represents how families operate," registered as comforting. Yet your spiritual perception, acute and unyielding, commenced capturing what your conscious mind had not yet acknowledged. You commenced perceiving the pattern. Every expression of concern functioned as a tether, every offered assistance functioned as a snare, and every expression of devotion functioned as a mask, concealing something far more sinister. They weren't constructing you upward. They were dismantling you incrementally, depleting you, draining your essence fragment by fragment, all while persuading you it represented an act of dedication. It wasn't allegiance, it represented control. It wasn't kinship, it represented confinement. And the blade they prepared carried significance beyond metaphor. It carried genuine consequence, the gradual death of your potential, your aspirations, your tranquility. They desired you, believing they maintained your welfare at heart, so you would resist nothing. Yet your awakened perception recognized through it. You identified the ceremony for its genuine nature, a sacrifice disguised as encouragement, a ritual of submission wrapped within smiles and hollow commitments. This recognition carried no ease. It destabilized your foundation, yet it also liberated you. Because once you perceived their truth, you ceased participating in their game. You ceased surrendering your authority disguised as affection, and that's when you genuinely commenced living. The blade was never designated to terminate your physical form. It was designated to terminate your spirit. Yet your perception preserved you. You survived the ceremony. You shattered their illusion. And presently you depart unbroken, wiser and fiercely alive. Number 10. Your untainted spirit functioned as a mirror, and they despised what they observed reflected. The fury and animosity directed toward you carried no connection to you whatsoever. It represented a response to the reflection you compelled them to confront. Your spirit, pure and uncontaminated, functioned as a mirror they desperately avoided gazing into. You didn't merely arrive as yourself. You arrived as a reminder of everything they denied, everything they buried internally, and that truth generated fear within them, exceeding any accusation or insult ever could. They invested years, potentially decades, constructing barriers surrounding their imperfections, concealing fractures through falsehoods and diversions. They perfected the craft of performance, concealing their fears, their regrets, their shame behind carefully assembled facades. Then you appeared, radiating your untainted light, reflecting backward the elements within them that had rotted and decayed. Suddenly, they observed the darkness they had been evading, and rather than confronting it, they directed their fury at the source of the reflection. You. Their rage represented projection, an emotional defense mechanism. They weren't furious because you committed wrongdoing. They were furious because you exposed what they feared most profoundly, their own fractured nature. Your purity didn't threaten them through its difference. It threatened them through its honesty. It revealed the chasm between whom they performed being and whom they genuinely were. And that chasm represented a wound they refused to address. So they attempted diminishing your illumination, silencing your truth, pulling you downward to their altitude. They refused acknowledging your correctness, because that acknowledgement would demand confronting their own failures. Instead, they projected hatred, judgment, and cruelty onto you in an effort to eliminate the mirror. Yet, mirrors don't shatter simply because someone desires their destruction. They persist, reflecting relentlessly. You functioned as their unwilling counselor. You compelled them to confront uncomfortable realities without deliberate effort. And because they couldn't process the reflection, they elected attacking the messenger rather than healing themselves. That explains the intensity of their hatred. It carried no personal element. It represented the conflict between their denial and your truth. And you survived because your spirit maintained purity while theirs drowned within shadow. Number 11. This transcended bullying. This represented a spiritual initiation disguised as social rejection. This extended beyond mere bullying, regardless of surface presentation. It represented a spiritual initiation disguised as social rejection, a severe passage of transformation few ever comprehend until they have experienced it personally. What society labeled as degradation genuinely marked the commencement of your anointing. It represents a paradox that authentic elevation, authentic authority, frequently arrives wrapped within public disgrace. The deeper the descent, the higher the subsequent rise. You didn't stumble into this through chance. You were selected for it, encoded for it, designed to bear it. When they singled you out, excluded you, and attempted dismantling you publicly, it carried no element of random cruelty. It represented a deliberate act designed to distinguish you from the collective. Most individuals are constructed to blend in, to follow the crowd and participate in the safe game. Yet you were never designed to conform to that pattern. You were forged to stand apart, to traverse a solitary path where sovereigns frequently walk alone. The ceremony represented their method of marking you as different, regardless of their conscious awareness. That public disgrace functioned as the world's method of attempting silencing your illumination, yet it genuinely amplified it. When you were expelled, you acquired the capacity to depend upon yourself in ways others never require. You developed a resilience and clarity that exclusively those who have experienced genuine isolation can comprehend. This represented your summons to ascend, not as a casualty but as a combatant, a leader, a chosen one. The anguish of rejection carries sharpness unquestionably, yet it also functions as a powerful crucible that refines your spirit and distinguishes your gold from the dross. They desired rendering you invisible, yet instead they rendered you unforgettable. And that stems from your never being designated to remain merely another face within the masses. You were encoded to stand alone, and within that solitude you discovered your throne. Number 12. You received the label of instability because your sanity destabilized their comfortable deceptions. They adhered the label of instability onto you as though it constituted a weapon designed to maintain your confinement within obscurity. Paranoid, emotional, sensitive, delusional. Those terms carried no honest descriptive function. They functioned as shields protecting the fragile illusion they had constructed around themselves. They hurled those terms toward you not from genuine belief, but from fear of your clarity. Your capacity to perceive through their carefully assembled deceptions represented a threat they couldn't tolerate. Labeling you unstable represented their method of isolating you, severing you from anyone who might attend. It constitutes a tactic ancient beyond measure. Discredit the messenger so the message never reaches its audience. Yet the truth remains, your so-called instability genuinely represented their method of declaring, "We cannot govern you." They despised your refusal to conform, that your perception carried excessive sharpness, excessive reality. You didn't merely question their narratives, you perceived through the fractures in their facades and refused performing as though everything remained acceptable. Their terminology attempted entrapping you, yet your cognition maintained clarity. Your spirit maintained unshakable stability. They labeled you emotional because your emotional responses exposed their cold manipulations. They labeled you paranoid because you declined overlooking the patterns they were weaving. And when they labeled you delusional, they genuinely feared your vision, the manner in which you perceived matters differently, extending beyond their shallow narratives. Presently, their silence constitutes the loudest element present. It represents fear masquerading as tranquility. They maintain quiet because they recognize truth stands alongside you, and they are losing their control. The composition of silence cannot conceal the fractures within their foundation. They labeled you unstable to conceal their own vulnerability. Yet in reality, your sanity functions as the mirror reflecting their deceptions back toward them, and that reflection terrifies them beyond any alternative. Number 13. They misinterpreted your restraint as vulnerability until you permitted truth to speak without words. They misread your silence, your composure, your decision against engagement as vulnerability. They believed that through pressuring you, ridiculing you, or betraying you, they maintained advantage, that you were fractured or insufficient to counterattack. Yet, they couldn't have erred more substantially. Your restraint carried no element of surrender. It represented strategy. You required no thrown strikes or shouted accusations. Instead, you observed quietly, accumulated evidence through your gaze and intuition, and permitted truth to execute the substantial labor. You operated as an investigator within plain view, observing every maneuver, every misstep, every concealed motive unfolding. You perceived through their masks, documented their contradictions, and preserved it all resembling a private record. While they remained occupied attempting entrapping you within conflict and deception, you were constructing your case silently. You comprehended that occasionally the most powerful force emerges not from volume, but from the consistent, unshakable presence of truth awaiting its revelation. They believed you lacked power because you failed responding as they anticipated. They assumed your silence indicated defeat or unawareness of unfolding events. Yet your silence represented the tranquility preceding the storm. It represented the quiet assurance of someone who recognized that truth demands no force. It simply requires permission to emerge according to its own schedule. You maintained faith that time served your interests, and consequently, you engaged the extended game. Presently, truth commences emerging. It surfaces within dialogues, within whispered admissions, within the irrefutable facts they can no longer conceal. And the optimal element, you haven't required lifting a finger to generate this outcome. The more intensely they attempted burying it, the more it surfaced beneath, unstoppable and undeniable. Your restraint carried no element of vulnerability. It represented wisdom, and it prevails. Number 14. You survived the degradation. Presently you possess the blueprint for dismantling the program. You navigated the flames of degradation and emerged to recount the experience. You functioned as more than a casualty captured within their scheme. You served as an eyewitness to the entire operation. You observed precisely how the cycle operated. Isolate the target, dismantle them through ridicule, distort their cognition through manipulation, then perform as the gracious deliverer presenting reconciliation when the target ultimately fractures. It constitutes a calculated system designed to shatter spirits and maintain individuals under control, resembling a program executing automatically. Yet you declined serving as the fractured component because you didn't merely survive, you comprehended. You peeled back the layers and decoded the entire ceremony. You observed the patterns and recognized how they fed upon shame to maintain individuals trapped. Their system depends upon silence, confusion, and the gradual erosion of self-regard. Yet your clarity and perception severed through all of that, resembling a blade. You recognized that their affection functioned as a weapon, their allegiance as a tether, and their concern as a snare. Presently that you have survived, you possess something vastly more powerful than your personal restoration. You possess the blueprint, the concealed manual for dismantling this toxic cycle. Your experience transcends being merely a narrative of anguish. It functions as a map, demonstrating to others how to identify the snares, resist the manipulation, and depart without forfeiting themselves. Your survival functions as a beacon, a guide for those still captured within the program, demonstrating their path toward freedom. You transformed what was designated to annihilate you into a wellspring of authority and knowledge, and that represents the genuine victory. The program that once attempted governing you now carries a fracture it never anticipated, a vulnerability exposed through your resilience. Your narrative transcends merely achieving survival. It concerns fracturing the cycle for every individual who follows. You didn't merely survive the degradation, you evolved into the blueprint for liberation. You survived what was designated to shatter you, a degradation ceremony crafted to demolish your spirit and silence your truth. Yet, rather than collapsing, you ascended. Every insult cast your direction, every public betrayal, every whispered falsehood functioned not as a chain, but as a challenge, a trial that refined your strength and sharpened your perception. What they interpreted as your vulnerability represented your concealed armor forged within the flames of their attempts to govern and diminish you. Your capacity to perceive through their masks and resist their manipulation carried no element of fortune. It represented survival, an unyielding force that preserved your very essence. You didn't merely endure, you decoded the system. You recognized the patterns of isolation, ridicule, and false reconciliation. You observed how their so-called affection functioned as a weapon concealed within allegiance, how their assaults connected less to you and more to their fear of the truth you embodied. Your untainted spirit functioned as a mirror reflecting their deepest insecurities and deceptions. And because they couldn't confront that reflection, they attempted diminishing your illumination. Yet your illumination merely intensified, unbreakable and undeniable. The silence you maintained carried no element of submission. It represented strategy, While they believed they were prevailing through labeling you unstable or emotional, you were quietly accumulating truth, observing their fractures widen, and preparing for the moment when reality would eclipse their deceptions. That moment has arrived. Truth surfaces unstoppable, carrying alongside it the authority to dismantle the toxic cycles designed to trap countless others. You possess the blueprint, a manual born not solely from survival, but from clarity and courage. Your journey from degradation to restoration functions as a guidepost for anyone still lost within that shadowed maze. Your narrative validates that what was designated as your downfall can transform into the foundation for freedom and metamorphosis. Remember this: you were never designated to blend in or accept silencing. You were encoded to stand alone, to govern with wisdom forged through fire. Your survival transcends being a miracle. It represents a revolution. And as you advance forward strengthened and wiser, you carry the authority not solely to restore yourself, but to shatter the programs that seek governing others. Your narrative represents the illumination penetrating the darkness, the truth that refuses burial, and the strength that reminds us all. Occasionally, the greatest victories emerge following the deepest anguish. If this message resonated within you, if it stirred something profound internally, then don't contain it privately. Activate that subscription button and join a community centered entirely on truth, resilience, and liberation from the chains that restrain us. Express appreciation for this video to demonstrate your readiness to rise beyond the deceptions and shame. Contribute a comment below. Share your narrative, your reflections, or even a single term that resonates because your voice carries significance here. And if you recognize someone still entrapped within that cycle, share this video with them. Together we're transcending mere survival. We're rewriting the governing principles. This channel transcends mere content. It represents a movement. So subscribe, express appreciation, contribute, and share, because the revolution commences with you.